Welcome to the Horizon Center School of Hypnotherapy, where we are committed to helping our students, graduates, and listeners be wildly successful in their practices. So, grab a pen and get ready to take notes while we talk about the 3 M's of a successful practice: mindset, mastery, and marketing. Now here's your host, clinical counseling hypnotherapist, Linda Campbell.
Hello, the topic of today's show is helping a client with complex trauma. I'm actually going to do a few shows on this topic because it's a really big topic. In today's show, we're going to talk about what complex trauma is, how it's different from PTSD, what situations will cause a person to develop complex trauma, some of the symptoms associated with it, as well as some of the coping mechanisms that people who have complex trauma will resort to. By understanding this topic, you're going to be able to help so many clients with so many different goals, because complex trauma, which is a relatively new concept, it's not a diagnosis in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Diagnoses, but it's related to many of the issues clients come in with. For example, there is some research suggesting that many of the physical issues that we can get can be traced back to trauma. If you've read books like When the Body Says No or The Body Keeps the Score, there are lots of well-documented cases in these books of people having developed certain physical conditions related to the experiences that they had early on in life. So we know that the mind and body cannot be separated. It used to be treated as though they were two different things. Mind, body. They do not speak to each other. But we now understand that the experiences that we have in our lives impact on us physically as well as emotionally and psychologically and can influence our physical well-being. There is a correlation between what's going on in our psychological and emotional worlds and what's going on in our physical body. So complex chronic trauma can also result in relationship issues, not just physical issues, and a variety of mental health issues. In fact, all of the following have been proven to stem back to complex trauma. Now, of course, there could be other reasons for these issues as well, but there is a correlation between these particular challenges and complex trauma. Addiction, depression, ADD, ADHD, and learning difficulties, anxiety disorder, conduct disorders, phobias, sexual dysfunction, dissociation, juvenile delinquency, attachment disorders, psychotic disorders, narcissistic disorder, bipolar disorder, even PTSD. The correlation between complex trauma and PTSD is actually an interesting one. How come some people can have a traumatic event occur in their life and that leaves them, shattered for years to come, whereas other people are able to bounce back more quickly? There is evidence that the people who end up with PTSD after a major event are the ones who have had complex trauma early on in life. In other words, they're set up from their earlier trauma to have post-traumatic stress should there be something that occurs later in life that's traumatic for them. So early trauma leads to more likelihood of PTSD. So by understanding complex trauma, you can help people with all of these various disorders, assuming, of course, that it was the trauma that caused them. And so let's look first at what trauma is and what differentiates complex trauma from other trauma. So there are essentially 2 types of trauma: simple trauma and complex trauma. Now, simple trauma is a one-time event that can lead to PTSD or not. So this could be, for example, a home invasion or a rape or a car accident. It's one incident that is traumatic in nature, whereas complex trauma occurs when a person is in a traumatic situation on an ongoing basis. So it's not just one example of being raped, it is being sexually molested over and over for a number of years or on a number of occasions. It's not just one experience of a home invasion. It's living with somebody who constantly invades your privacy or constantly makes you feel unsafe, or living with somebody who's critical of you on an ongoing basis. So it's an ongoing series of events that creates complex trauma. So some examples: growing up with a parent who's an alcoholic or who is drug dependent can lead to complex trauma. You've got this ongoing situation where you feel unsafe. If you don't know what state your parent is going to be in, if they're checked out somehow, or if they're violent or unpredictable, that can lead to complex trauma. Having a parent who's a rageaholic or who has some other emotional difficulty. For example, somebody who's so depressed that they can't drag themselves out of bed. This could lead to a child experiencing complex trauma because they didn't have that parent available to them. Having a parent who has mental health issues overall, or like a narcissistic parent, or being put in a position where you were forced into the role of being the caretaker to an adult. So situations where you've had to grow up more quickly than you might have otherwise. All of these things could lead to having complex trauma. Now, some people are aware that they've had trauma. Other people don't realize that's the case. So I had a client, for example, who had experienced ritualistic satanic abuse growing up. She knew that she had trauma. I've had many clients over the years who have experienced some kind of sexual trauma, repeated sexual violations. They know they've experienced complex trauma. They may not know the name of it necessarily, but they know that they've experienced it. However, the client doesn't necessarily always recognize that they've experienced complex trauma. For some people, the environment was just normal to them. They didn't realize until later on, when they had something to contrast it to, that it was actually a traumatic environment. For example, if you grow up in an environment with a depressed parent or an alcoholic parent or somebody who's struggling with an illness, it can just feel normal to you. It's so typical for you to experience that environment day after day after day that until you see a contrasting environment, you don't realize necessarily that your environment is unhealthy or atypical. For example, I had a client who, as a child, lived in a home where there was just constant drug use and drug paraphernalia all around him. He told me that there would be drug paraphernalia on the table in the living room, needles, drugs everywhere. It was common for him to come home and find people passed out all over the place. And so because he grew up this way, he didn't realize that this wasn't normal until he was old enough to start visiting the houses of his friends, and he saw that they didn't have drug paraphernalia all over the place. There weren't passed out people on the floors all hours of the night and day. And so some people don't even realize that they've been in an environment that has produced or created a trauma for them because it's so consistent for them that they don't see it as abnormal. I had another client who was molested by her father, and the father told her that it was a father's job to prepare a young lady for having sex, that it was his responsibility to initiate her into the world of sexuality. And she didn't realize that not all dads were that way with their daughters. To her, it was just normal, until she had a conversation with a friend of hers and found out that her dad wasn't teaching her about sex. Then she began to realize that something was up. So there will be clients who come in and say to you, I had a traumatic upbringing, or I've had traumatic events in my life. But then there are clients who will come in and they think that their background or their history was just standard. It was normal. It's just what it was. So they're not necessarily going to sit in front of you and say, I had this trauma. It's by having a conversation with them and asking them some questions that we actually start to piece together that they did in fact have a traumatic upbringing. So as a bit of an aside, it's really important when you're dealing with a client that we ask questions and dig a little bit to find out what their reality was. If somebody says, I had a perfectly normal childhood, you really have no idea what that means. Now, the problem is we tend to look through our own particular lens. If somebody says they had a normal childhood, you compare it to your concept of normal and to what your childhood might have been like or what you think a normal childhood is, and you might think their childhood was like that. But what was normal for them may not be normal for you. My client who said it was normal for him to come home and find people passed out in the house just thought that was how things were for everybody. And so when somebody has a perception of what normal is, we want to ask some questions and make sure that we understand what their reality is. I had a young client once who told me she had the usual normal kind of breakup, and so I asked her what that looked like. And she said, well, he threw some things at me. He called me a slut. I punched him in the face. You know, a normal breakup. So when you hear things like, oh, my dad was depressed, or I had a normal childhood, or my mom was really critical, or whatever, ask for examples. Ask them to tell you what that would look like. You know, what did it look like that your dad was depressed? What would you have experienced of that? What would you have seen? What would you have understood? What was actually going on? How did it impact you? We've got to dig a little bit deeper because the person doesn't necessarily have the same perception that you do. It's also important to remember that what matters is the client's perception. There is the actual experience of what took place, and then there's the client's perception of that event or that experience. And what matters is the client's perception. Two people can have a completely different perception of the same event. And so again, we need to understand the client's perception. We need to understand the point of view of the client. So never make assumptions that you know what your client is talking about. Ask questions so that you can get a fuller picture of what's going on for them. All right, so back to talking about complex trauma. The effects of trauma happen on a subconscious level. So many people, again, may not be aware that they've been affected or that they've had trauma. So they may be coming to see you for something that they're struggling with, a symptom they want to get rid of, but they don't necessarily recognize that it's related to some kind of trauma. For example, I've had clients, mostly women, who have come to see me about their trust issues or their sexual dysfunction. And sure enough, when we do a bit of uncovering work in hypnosis to find out where that symptom came from, it goes back to having had some ongoing sexual trauma. I had a client who was having a difficult time getting over a breakup. He described himself as absolutely obsessed with his ex. He knew that she wasn't good for him, but he could not get her out of his mind. He was driving by her house, trying to figure out what she was doing and what she was up to, stalking her on Facebook, despite the fact that he knew this relationship was just not healthy and not viable. And so in hypnosis, we looked for any potential cause for this obsession. And what came up was that his mother had committed suicide when he was a child. And he had felt as though he couldn't rescue her. That trauma that he had as a child left a mark on him. And so the reason he was having such a hard time letting go of his ex was because she too was emotionally unstable and would go through bouts of depression and suicidal ideation. So he felt as though on some level he had to rescue this woman where he wasn't able to rescue his mom. So of course it would make sense that he couldn't let go of her. In his child's mind, if he couldn't rescue her, something terrible was going to happen, just like what happened to his mom. So sometimes people are coming to work on their current problem, but it stems back to something earlier. There's a trauma that they haven't resolved, something they haven't fully processed. Now, there's a phenomena called repetition compulsion, where people tend to repeat the kind of trauma that they sustained earlier on, as though by repeating it, they could resolve it in some way. So, for example, if a person had cold, critical, abusive parents, they might attract partners who are cold and abusive and critical. It's almost as though they have this compulsion to repeat the type of relationship that they had with their parents, as though by doing so they could get an opportunity to finally resolve it. I couldn't resolve it with mom and dad, so I'm going to resolve it with this step in for my parent. Or people might just repeat some act that was done to them early on. So if a person had a lot of abuse growing up, they might be drawn into relationships where they'll be abused one way or the other. So again, this happens on a subconscious level. It's not as though the client says, oh, I must find an abusive partner because that's what I experienced growing up. In fact, sometimes the client doesn't even pick up on those cues in the person until it's too late. So the client doesn't necessarily know that it's related to anything in the past. In hypnosis, of course, we can find out where that pattern came from, where that behavior or that impulse came from. We can trace it back to its origins. Now, when I met my husband, he was a hypnotist. And at the beginning of our relationship, before he studied hypnotherapy, he would occasionally refer to me as a hypnotist. And I would jump in and I'd be like, oh, no. After he took my training and learned that there's a huge difference between doing hypnosis and doing hypnotherapy, we no longer have that issue. So the client coming in to do hypnotherapy doesn't necessarily know what they're getting in for, that there's a therapeutic component to it. Oftentimes people confuse hypnosis with hypnotherapy. They think they're the same thing. And so we need to work with clients and explain the difference between doing hypnosis and doing hypnotherapy. We need them to understand that the work that we're doing as hypnotherapists is therapeutic in nature. That means it involves doing a deep dive into relevant events in the client's life, relationships that they've experienced. We're looking at their history. We're looking at patterns that are repeating in their lives. And so again, sometimes people have a misunderstanding about hypnosis. They think that they're going to just get in the chair and you're basically going to say some fluffy words, some nice words to them, and then send them out different from how they came in. So somebody comes in with trust issues and they think you're just going to put them in the chair and say, you have an easy time trusting people. You're just going to suggest away their symptoms. But that isn't hypnotherapy. That's hypnosis, putting somebody into a hypnotic state and just giving them basically affirmations. Hypnotherapy actually involves looking at where that symptom originated and then working through whatever that event was. And so there are events in our lives that cause us to form beliefs, and those beliefs lead to symptoms. So if a person has a symptom of mistrust, there's an event that is responsible for that belief. I can't trust people. We're working on changing the belief, and we change the belief by looking at where did that belief come from? What was the event or series of events in the case of complex trauma that taught that person that they can't trust? So we're looking for any relevant past events that have led to this person having a symptom. So if you have somebody who's been abused, who has complex trauma, some of the beliefs they get out of that are, I'm not worthy, I'm not valuable, people can hurt me, I'm not safe. If the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally can hurt me, then I can't trust people to treat me kindly. So I'm going to be closed down. I'm going to be shut off. I'm going to have great big walls up. Again, they often have a belief that they're unsafe and therefore they need to stay vigilant in order to protect themselves. So if you're just trying to suggest away symptoms, but they still believe that they're unsafe, the symptoms aren't going to go away. So we need to educate, to inform the client who comes in and thinks that we're just going to give them some positive suggestions and that's going to change everything. We need to explain to them why we have to go into these past events, why we need to understand the impact of what's occurred. And we need to let them know what that's going to involve. I personally don't agree with people going back and having to relive experiences. There are a lot of hypnotherapists and therapists in general who think that in order to resolve a trauma, you need to go through it again and again and again until there's no emotion around it. I do not agree with that at all. I think if a person has been traumatized once or on various occasions, why the heck would I want to traumatize them again? And when you take a person back through an experience in hypnosis, without doing it carefully, they can re-experience it like it's happening again, and they're back at the age they were when that event occurred. So my approach is more about helping the client understand how an event has impacted on them. What did they come to believe about themselves or about the world? What coping mechanisms did they develop as a result of that event? And how can we work on updating, modifying the beliefs that they developed as well as the coping mechanisms? How can we work on changing the impact of that event? So I'm straying a little bit away from my plan here a bit, but my point is the effects of trauma happen on a subconscious level. We need to help the client to understand why we're going into these past events so that we can relieve them of their symptoms instead of just suggesting them away. Now, if you're listening to this and you have not been trained to carefully help a person to understand the cause of their symptoms, if you've not been trained to do regression, if all you've been trained to do is give a person suggestions, then you need more training. Let me give you an example. I had a client who came to see me for smoking. He was 28 years old when he started smoking, which seemed really early in life to pick up a smoking habit. So I was asking him during the consultation why he started smoking at 28. What was going on in his life that caused him to pick up smoking? What he shared with me during the consultation was that when he was 28, he got his first real job and everybody there smoked. So it was a way to bond with his coworkers. It was a way to deal with the stress of having this new job. So I'm working those angles in hypnosis. I'm assuming that his symptom of smoking is about managing stress and bonding. So I'm talking about you don't need to smoke to fit in. There's other ways to manage stress. We're a couple sessions in and he's not getting anywhere. My opinion is if a person's not moving forward within a couple sessions, it's because we've missed some really important information. There's no point just doing the same session over and over and over and hoping it's going to stick this time. I need to look for what did we miss. So in session number 3, we did some regression to figure out where his smoking behavior came from. And what he never thought to tell me during the consultation, here's the trauma, was he had shot a friend of his in a hunting accident when he was 28 years old. Now, the guy didn't die, but he spent 6 or 8 weeks in intensive care, and my client felt so guilty at the time that he started smoking because he didn't think he deserved a good life. Now, I'm doing hypnosis on, you don't need to smoke to fit in. There's other ways to manage stress. I'm not even in the ballpark. This is why I say we've got to be able to trace back where a symptom originated instead of just trying to suggest away the symptom. I could have done 1,000 sessions with this guy on you don't need to smoke to fit in, but I'm not even talking about the right thing. Now, as soon as I did work around that trauma, so basically talking to his subconscious. So when I say we want to look at how that event would have impacted on him. So what did he learn from that event? What he started telling himself was, I'm guilty. I did a bad thing. I don't deserve to have a good life. And then that led to a bunch of symptoms, one of them being picking up a smoking habit. So I can't change the event. I can't, put him in hypnosis and say, it never happened. That doesn't work. That is very dismissive of your client. Don't do that. But I can change the belief. So he had a belief that because of this, I don't deserve a good life. So basically my hypnosis session was around reminding him that this guy was still his best friend. There was no bad blood between them. It was an accident. He deserves to have a good life. When I took that approach, not only did he give up smoking, he started taking off weight, and he looked into a career change because he had been holding himself back in these other areas as well for that same reason. He didn't think he deserved a good life. So this is why we have to educate the client. If that client is coming in to work on smoking and he doesn't really understand hypnotherapy and that it's about uncovering cause and addressing the cause of the symptom, he's going to think that I'm just going to put him in the chair and tell him, you're a non-smoker. I don't even know how I'd fill an hour saying you're a non-smoker. So the client needs to understand that we're going to be looking for the cause of that symptom. And as a hypnotherapist, that's the kind of training you need to have. If you're just trained to, get your smoking cessation script and read it to a client who's passively resting in the chair, you're never going to get to the point where you're uncovering cause with them. Okay, so that's just a little bit of an aside as well. I feel pretty passionately about that. I think there's a lot of really bad hypnosis going on out there where people are basically reading scripts. That's essentially how I was trained. And I didn't know what I didn't know at the time. I didn't know there was more to it. I accidentally stumbled into realizing that clients could talk to you, that clients had insight, that you could direct them to their own source of insight. You could get them to tell you where their symptoms came from. All of that happened accidentally, and I'm so thankful it did. I get really good results with my clients now because that's what we're doing. We're looking for, where does this stem back to? Where does this come from? Okay, back to complex trauma. So let's back up a little bit and look at, how do you know if you've experienced complex trauma? So there's essentially 4 different places that complex trauma comes from. Number 1, if you grew up in a family that was abusive in some way, with an abusive family member, that can cause complex trauma. Now, this doesn't have to be physical abuse, although physical abuse certainly counts. But all of the following count as abuse as well. Criticism, name-calling, being teased, taunted, mocked, ridiculed, humiliated. This could be in your environment at home. It could be a parent. It could be a sibling. But it could also occur at school or at work. So it's not necessarily just your home environment. Somebody who grew up being picked on by the bullies over and over for years and years in school has experienced complex trauma. Maybe they had a loving home life. Maybe there was nothing going on at home, but school is traumatic for them. So when you're talking to your clients, find out about their home life, what school was like for them academically as well as socially. Again, we want to get all of this information. So any situation where somebody is more powerful than you, they're in a position of power and they're in some way hurting you. And so this could be the father who's a dictator, where you can't challenge him. You have to do what he tells you to do. You're kind of disempowered. It could be an older sibling who's constantly mocking you, won't let you walk beside them on the way to school, teases you in the hallway. So any environment where there's ongoing abuse. The second place that complex trauma comes from is an environment that involves neglect. And in some cases, this can even do greater damage than physical or verbal abuse. So this could be a situation where a parent is never around, so the kids are left to fend for themselves. A parent is not emotionally available because they have their own issues. Maybe a situation where somebody wasn't there for you when you were hurt or when you needed them. So you felt rejected or abandoned or unsafe. So any environment where there's some kind of neglect. The third category is an environment where there is some sort of abandonment. So we'll see this with a child who's been adopted. Even if a client says to you, I was adopted, but I don't think it had an impact on me, I'm still kind of curious to find out if, in fact, on a subconscious level, there was some impact that the client just wasn't aware of. I mean, I think, we're floating around in this nice warm space, and we're hearing our mother's voice, and we're hearing our mother's heartbeat. And then suddenly this person who was our source of safety and, this familiar environment is no longer there. Even if we're adopted into a home where people are loving and kind to us, I think on some level we still recognize that something that felt safe and warm and good disappeared. All right. So abandonment, where a child has been adopted, where Child Protective Services has had to come in, where people have been sent to foster homes. It could happen in an environment where there's a divorce or where there's some kind of instability. So any situation where the person feels as though I've been abandoned or I've been rejected, it doesn't have to be an actual experience of abandonment. Remember, what matters is the client's perception. So this could be a parent dying young, making you feel as though you were left behind. I had a client whose parents went away when she was a couple years old for their very first trip without her. And although things were prepared ahead of time and she was taken to grandma's house with all kinds of toys and things that were familiar to her, she didn't really understand that they were coming back. And so the whole time she was there, she was assuming that she had been abandoned. You spend a couple of weeks thinking, I've been left by my parents. That's going to stick in your psyche. So often when I'm doing a consultation with a client, I'm listening for their losses, because a lot of the symptoms that they come in for are a result of some loss that we've experienced. Whether that's a loss of innocence in the case of sexual trauma, the loss of a parent or a sibling or whatever through death or divorce, the loss of a pet. A move could lead to a loss of your familiar environment, your friends, your home, what was certain, what you knew. So anything that creates some kind of insecurity could ultimately result in complex trauma. Then there's the fourth category, where there's been a failure to meet our basic human needs. Now, of course, as human beings, we have many, many needs. And if there's ever a situation or a series of events where those needs don't get met, then this can lead to complex trauma as well. So some of those needs: safety, food, shelter, feeling of having a place where you're safe. We have a need for respect, to feel valued, being respected for who we are, having a sense of belonging, being validated, having people believe and recognize you, having people stand behind you, stand up for you, a sense of fairness and justice, consistent rules. We need all of these things growing up. Honesty, being able to trust other people, being trusted by other people. Having people believe us when we tell them something, having people, be there for us. We have a need for intimacy and secrecy, being able to have privacy, not having somebody pry into your secrets, being able to be emotionally connected to other people, having boundaries, having unconditional love, having privacy. I think I mentioned that. These are all needs that we have. And if these needs are violated, if we're not respected, if people don't believe us when we're struggling with something, if there's a sense of unfairness or injustice, the older sister always gets all the attention, the perks, and I have to do the Cinderella grunt work. If there's a lack of honesty, all of this can lead to complex trauma. And so those are the four categories or situations where complex trauma is developed. So as a kid, when we're going through these situations, we need to have some coping mechanisms available to us. And so there's all kinds of coping mechanisms that may be a result of complex trauma. Now, if you think of the position that a child is in, because a lot of this is happening when we're children, kids are pretty defenseless, right? They can't often speak up for themselves or advocate for themselves. They can't change a situation. Maybe if they try to speak up for themselves, it falls on deaf ears, or it just leads to more problems. It leads to them having even more trauma. If you're trying to speak up, to state your case, make a case for yourself against an abusive parent, chances are that could go sideways and lead to even more abuse. So kids are pretty defenseless and powerless. They can't leave a situation they don't like. Where would they go, right? They can't change it, so they have to find some way to cope. So the coping mechanisms that we tend to rely on are not necessarily healthy ones, but they're what's available at the time. And the problem is the subconscious works in such a way that once we develop a coping mechanism to deal with a situation or an environment that we're in, sometimes that coping mechanism can be maintained long after the situation has passed. The subconscious has no awareness of passage of time. So if it was important for you to have a particular coping mechanism at an earlier point in your life because that situation, that coping mechanism was necessary there, the subconscious doesn't go, oh, I'm no longer in that situation. I guess I can let go of this. It thinks if I needed that then, I'm going to need it forever. So even when the person is no longer in the environment, they can still be maintaining a coping mechanism. So it's important to remember the job of the subconscious is keep you safe. So when you come up with a way to keep yourself safe in an environment of abuse or abandonment or neglect, even when you're no longer in that environment, those old coping mechanisms can still be maintained. So let's look at some coping mechanisms. One of them is addiction. People are kind of funny. We like to feel good. We don't like to feel bad. And so if we feel bad, we try to cover up that feeling. We try to numb it or mask it or feel something different or not feel what we're feeling. And this is sometimes why addiction occurs. It can be a way to cover up an uncomfortable feeling, to try and not feel that bad feeling. And this could be any kind of addiction. This could be drugs or alcohol, but it could also be addiction to porn or work or exercise, shopping, gambling, anything where we're using some substance or some behavior to not feel our feelings or to distract ourselves away from what we're feeling. Now, another coping mechanism could be self-harm. A lot of people, if they're in an environment where they're not safe, their feelings are really uncomfortable for them. It's scary to feel unsafe all the time. And so the option here is to dissociate, to not feel. And so a lot of people will experience a numbing or a sense of unreality, like they're not really in their bodies. They're not really in the experience, kind of a checking out. Now, sometimes people believe that self-harm is the client being suicidal or the client trying to hurt themselves. But oftentimes it's actually a client who is numbed out trying to feel something. I need to hurt myself in order to feel. Now, another coping strategy could be weight gain. This could be a way of dealing with unwanted sexual attention. It's common for me to discover when I'm working with weight loss clients that they had some sexual trauma in their past. The subconscious wants to protect, and so the logic is if I put on weight, maybe nobody will show an interest in me sexually, and then I'm safe. I'm good. But weight can also be a way to keep yourself buffered. It's almost like this protective coating that protects you from the negativity of your environment. Now, of course, a common coping mechanism is hypervigilance. There's a lot of us are familiar with fight or flight, but there's also a third option. If we feel we are in danger, flight or fight are usually our first choices. If we think we can escape the situation, we'll try to flee. If we think we can fight back against the attacker, we will choose fight. So in a situation where we feel like we can't flee and we can't protect ourselves or defend ourselves against our attacker, the third choice that we'll resort to is to freeze. So if you've ever been driving on the highway at night and you see a rabbit or a deer on the side of the road and for a moment they're just still, not moving, that's the freeze response. If we think we can't get away and we can't protect ourselves against an oncoming threat, we freeze up. Now, in the animal world, a lot of predators only see their prey when they move. So we still have this built into us. If we stay still, maybe the predator won't see us. And sometimes people don't understand the freeze response. They feel as though it's their body betraying them. I had a client who went for a massage in a foreign country, and the person giving her the massage started fondling her. And she ended up freezing. Initially she thought, well, maybe this is just how they do massage in this country. I don't know. I'm not familiar with the customs. But the thing that was most difficult for her when she came to work on this event with me with hypnosis was that she couldn't get up and leave. She felt as though her body had somehow betrayed her because she knew what was happening wasn't okay and she wanted to run out of there, but she couldn't move. So she needed to understand that that's a normal response, unfortunately, that the body will choose sometimes. If you don't feel you can run away and you can't push back or push off your attacker, you can't leave the situation, you'll just freeze up. So you hear of people who are in their head, they realize what's going on, or they're watching it from outside of their body, but they can't move their body. This is an escape mechanism to cope with a situation, but it can be enduring. It can last even after the threat has passed. So I often see that hypervigilance in clients who have had some kind of trauma in their past, particularly if they've had an unpredictable parent or somebody who poses a threat to them in their environment. If you can't get away, you learn to be hypervigilant. if you are able to read the room, to sense the energy, be one step ahead of that person, reading what they're doing all the time, this is a way to protect yourself. If you can sense when there's going to be danger 3 seconds before the danger occurs, 3 seconds before that hand comes at you or that person yells at you or throws something, then you can get yourself out of there. Now, another coping mechanism is distraction. Distraction can be a way to avoid what we feel again. So this could be somebody who's spending their time on video games or chilling out in front of Netflix, or they're just trying to avoid dealing with their feelings. And then there are people who splinter, who dissociate. It's not safe to be here, so I'm taking off. They leave their bodies. And again, the subconscious doesn't realize that you're now in a safe place. The threat has passed. You're in a different situation. So once that coping mechanism is developed, often it maintains. Now, I also see coping mechanisms that sometimes people think are just like personality traits. For example, perfectionism and people-pleasing. I often see these two traits in people who have had traumatic backgrounds. If you have grown up with somebody who was abusive or somebody who was critical, you're trying to figure out what you need to be in order to feel safe. Maybe if I'm better somehow, if I'm perfect, then that person can't be critical of me. There's nothing to be critical of if I'm perfect. Or maybe if I make that person happy, if I'm a people pleaser, if I'm, figuring out what they need me to do or need me to be, and I'm making them happy, then they'll leave me alone. I'm protecting myself by adopting the people-pleasing coping mechanism or the perfectionism mechanism because it's going to get this person to back off in some way. Now, there could certainly be other coping mechanisms, but just knowing that these are often tied into complex trauma will serve you. So again, I really recommend that when clients come to see you and they're talking to you about your symptoms, that you really take a very thorough history, find out about their childhood, their background, their upbringing, what the people they grew up with were like. Did they have their own challenges? Did they feel safe growing up? Was there any neglect? Was there any, feelings of disempowerment that they experienced? Find out about their school life as well. Was there anything going on there? And, if it doesn't come out during the consultation, knowing techniques that you can use in hypnosis, like parts therapy, talk to the part of yourself that understands where this, nail biting or this addiction or this dissociation comes from, so that you can get answers that way. Sometimes the client doesn't necessarily know where their symptom comes from, and doing a history doesn't really point to anything. Other clients, like I said, they know they've had trauma and they've pieced it together already. But if the client doesn't have any idea, we can always get the answers from them in hypnosis. Now, this is going to be a series on complex trauma because there's so much to say about this topic, but I hope that you've got some ideas as to how it shows up, what it looks like, what differentiates it from PTSD, what some of the, factors are that contribute to it, what kind of coping mechanisms people might adopt. Come back next week and we will do part 2 where we'll start talking about how we can address complex trauma with hypnosis. Thank you so much for listening in. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks for listening. Remember to check out the Horizon Center School of Hypnotherapy.com for courses, products, and to take advantage of the free test drive of the Hypnotherapy Certification Training.